Well, good morning. You know, Lucius Dementos Anaerobus was born on June 9th of AD 37. He was born in Antium, Italy, and as the story is told, even shortly after he was born, he was just a little bit different than most babies. When most babies would simply cry, he seemed to display something resembling more like anger or rage. And when he didn't get what he wanted, he would often wail for hours. Lucius' biological father died when he was only 2 years old under some very suspicious circumstances, I understand. And he was raised almost entirely by his mother. His mother happened to be the great-granddaughter of Emperor Augustus. And she's described by historians as being manipulative and unforgiving and prone to angry outbursts. It's well documented that after her first husband passed away, that she quickly remarried again. And after only a few years, she's known to have killed her second husband by feeding him some poisonous mushrooms. History tells us that she killed her husband so that she could marry another man who just happened to be her uncle and who just happened to be the current emperor. And that made Lucius' mother the wife of Emperor Claudius. Through a whole series of lies and deceptions, and after Lucius and his mother successfully poisoned and killed Emperor Claudius, Lucius came to power, and with the help of his mother, the two of them went on this rampage. I don't know what else to call it, but a rampage, systematically eliminating everyone who was loyal to the previous emperor, which even included the public execution of 40 senators. And for the first time, absolute power in the Roman Empire was given to a 16-year-old boy. And in AD 49, Lucius changed his name to Nero. What followed was a few years that saw Nero and his mom literally taking out anyone and everyone that they felt could threaten Nero's reign. And as all of that was going on, and as it was bad enough, one day, something seemed to snap inside of Nero. And although nobody really knows what the catalyst to that was, things in the Roman Empire were about to go from bad to worse. Nero was already seen as this narcissistic, unstable, insecure, and unpredictable leader. But something changed, and he would add cruel and sadistic to that already horrible list of traits. And what happened for a period of 35 months was that the Roman Empire saw a level of brutality that up to that point they had not seen. And although part of this history has some gaps, it appears that 35 months were bracketed by two specific events. The first being Nero executing his mother, and the other end of that 35-month period was Nero having his wife executed. And in between those two events, he did whatever he wanted without fear of retribution or pushback from anyone. During this time, Nero enacted a community event that happened almost daily, that would often take place during the daily lunch break so that everybody could attend. And this event was called Damnatio ad Dinestis. And it was at Nero's command that his guards would be told to round up Christian families, to falsely accuse them of a crime, and then to place them in an arena alongside wild animals like lions, leopards, and wild boars. And the spectators would watch and cheer as the animals killed them. It was AD 64 that Rome had a huge fire that many of you may have heard about that resulted in almost 70% of Rome being left in ruins. And while most people believe that Nero was the one who started that fire because he was always talking about how he wished that he could start fresh with Rome and create it in his image. And although most people believed it was him, Nero, as we know, blamed the Christians for burning it down. And much like Hitler blamed the Jews for all of society's problems, Nero did that with Christians. In fact, he was even known to blame natural disasters on them and their God, who apparently had power over the weather. Eventually, he ended up outlawing the Christian faith, and the Roman government was very vocal in claiming that these followers of Jesus, or as they like to be called, the people of the way, Nero liked to say that they were the disease and he was the cure. And the people of Rome, they were angry. They were furious. Their homes and their businesses had burnt to the ground. And here was their emperor providing them with a scapegoat. Okay, you might be sitting there wondering why the history lesson this morning. Well, I share that with you because Nero's 35-month season of destruction occurred between AD 62 and AD 64. Rome burnt to the ground in AD 64, and the reason why this history lesson is significant to us is because Peter wrote the letter that we know as 1 Peter in AD 64. And it's to these Christians that he is penning the words of 1 Peter. And they were the ones that fled this narcissistic, unstable, insecure man's wrath. And now, I want you to just let that sink in for a moment. Because it's to those Christians that Peter writes these words in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. He says, "Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." It's to those Christians that Peter wrote these words in chapter 2, verse 13. He says, "Be subject to the Lord's sake to every institution, every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors, as sent by them to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people." And it's to those Christians that Peter wrote these words in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17. "Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." And I wonder, how hard do you think that would have been for them to have heard those words? I mean, how hard do you think it would have been for the people to hear this, knowing that Peter was talking about that emperor? How hard do you think it would have been for them to hear these words, knowing that it was their friends, maybe their families, that were fed to the wild animals in the arena? And what I don't want us to miss as we unpack today's section together is that Peter isn't just offering them some good advice that he thinks they should consider, but he's saying to them, this is what it means to represent Jesus well. And in the section that we're going to look at this morning, Peter is moving away from giving specific advice like he's been doing to servants and to wives with unbelieving husbands and to husbands with unbelieving wives. And this piece of guidance is now being targeted towards everybody that's listening. And in the specific section that we're going to be unpacking this morning, Peter is offering 4 pieces of advice to the people that were living under the fear and the persecution of Rome and Nero. And it's interesting that verse 8 starts off with the word finally. By implication, Peter is saying that he's in the process of wrapping up this thought because he wants to start a new one. But he says finally because he wants to bring conclusion to what he's been talking about. Specifically, he's wrapping up the answer to the question of how do you deal with persecution in a way that represents Jesus well? And the first piece of advice that Peter is providing is found in verse 8, where this is what he says. He says, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. And again, try and put yourself in the shoes of the people who would have been hearing this for the first time, or try putting on the glasses of these first century Christians, as we talked about last week. Because Peter's first piece of advice to them is to guard their hearts. Again, he says, have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. And again, I throw this question at you. How hard do you think that would have been after all they had been through? And with all the persecution that they were dealing with as a daily reality, how hard do you think that would have been? And part of what Peter is saying here is that they need to guard their hearts against bitterness and anger and thoughts of revenge. And he's saying to guard their hearts against discouragement and disillusionment and feelings of isolation. And he says, instead of all that stuff that might be much more natural to you, he said, instead, all of you have unity of mind. And remember that you are the new elect exiles, set apart for a greater purpose. He says, instead, have sympathy and have brotherly love. He says, remember that you're not going through this alone. And you need to let this persecution bind you together as a community rather than pulling you apart from one another. He says, instead, have a tender heart and have a humble mind. And maybe if you're able to put yourself in the shoes of these Christians hearing it for the first time, maybe you're saying, really, Peter? Like, that's the best advice that you can give us? When you think of all that we've been through in the past many years, this is what you want us to do? You know, there's a saying in pop psychology today that difficulties can either make you better or bitter. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that Peter is saying that to these people, but I do think that he's challenging them to guard their hearts. He's encouraging them to not let these difficulties drive them apart, but instead, he's reminding them that they have been knit together by a cause that is so much bigger than they are. He's saying, don't let this persecution become a wedge between you. But instead, he says, have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. He says, don't let your heart grow hard because of what's happening to you and around you. Well, Peter's second piece of advice is also one that I'm sure would have maybe put a lump in their throat. And Peter tells them to love their enemies. In verse 9 to 12, this is what Peter writes to them. He says, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. And then in verse 10, this is what he writes. He says, whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. And it's fascinating in these verses that Peter is quoting Psalm 34, the psalm that Kevin read earlier. And Psalm 34 really is this beautiful hymn that's written by David as a song of thanksgiving for a specific time, a specific story where God miraculously intervened and saved his life from certain death. And I really wish we had more time this morning to go back and look at the backstory of that psalm, because it's based on 1 Samuel 21, verses 10, all the way to chapter 22, verse 1. And I got to tell you, take the time this afternoon to go read this whole story, because it is a crazy story of how King David was captured by the king of Gath and how he subsequently escaped. And I'm just saying, if there's any movie writers or directors watching this, this might just be the best blockbuster film to be made in the past many, many decades. But let me give you a brief synopsis of it, because it starts with David being captured, and in verse 12 of 1 Samuel 21, we're told this. It says, David was much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. But it's in verse 13 that things start to get just a little bit strange, because we're told that, so he, that being David, changed his behavior before the king and his men and pretended to be insane in their hands, and he made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. Okay, so you're visualizing this with me. This is David that we're talking about here. Verse 14, then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to me to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come to my house? And the better translation of that is, are you expecting me to invite this gentleman over for supper? And so the king of Gath ends up letting David go, because he concludes that he can't be that David. He has to be a madman. But you know, when we move back to Psalm 34, it's interesting that this psalm that David wrote as a reflection on that specific encounter in Gath. So this is what David is saying about it. He says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. He says in verse 4, I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and he delivered me from my fears. In verse 6, he says, this poor man cried, that being David himself. And the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. And again, this is where it gets interesting, because this is David's conclusion. And again, try and put yourself in the shoes of those Christians that Peter is writing to as they're referring back to Psalm 34. He writes in verse 7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. O fear the Lord, you saints, for those who fear him have no lack. And then David writes this. He says, the young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. And again, let's go back to the people that Peter was writing to. And you tell me, what do you think they're hearing in those specific verses? I think that they heard Peter reminding them that the same God who miraculously rescued David and caused him to say, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. I think that he's saying to those people that the same God that helped David is near to them in these moments where things seem to be falling apart and things seem to be spiraling out of control. David said, oh, fear the Lord, you his saints, for those who fear him will have no lack. And Peter is telling this group of persecuted Christians to cling to that fear of the Lord. And if they do, they will not be disappointed by what the Lord comes back to them with. I also wonder if Peter brought up verse 10, the verse that talked about the young lions being hungry, because he knew how Nero was using young lions in the arena. I have no way of knowing that. I'm just speculating. I wonder if maybe he brought that up to remind these Christians of what Nero was doing to their friends and maybe even their family members. Again, David wrote, "The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing." And Peter is saying in these verses that it's so easy when we suffer and when we experience persecution and when we're in a place where bad people are doing bad things and they seem to be getting away with it. And our knee-jerk reaction might be to be angry or bitter. And Peter is saying, be like David and allow God to turn that fear into thanksgiving. That God is faithful. He has been faithful to David, and he will be faithful to you. Peter says, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may be obtaining a blessing. You know, if anyone had the right to be angry throughout their life at their enemies, it likely would have been David. And in this psalm, Peter is saying that David is a good example to follow, because he could have been consumed with anger at the injustice, but instead of being bitter, he became better. And he turned what had happened to him into an opportunity for praise and thanksgiving. But there's another important piece of advice that Peter offers to this church, and this is in verses 13 and 14, where he reminds them that if they are following Jesus, he says, remember that their suffering is inevitable. Again, not a very encouraging proposition, is it? But Peter says to them in verse 13, he says, now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. He goes on to say, have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. They probably didn't need any convincing of this, because they had suffered probably from the moment that they had made their commitment to Christ. From the moment that they accepted Christ, they probably understood that this is part of what they were signing up for. Likely had been part of their experience since day one. And again, keep in mind here that they've already had to flee their homes thinking that they were arriving in a place that was maybe going to be more tolerant or a better, safer place to raise their families. But only to find out that the type of persecution that Nero was amping up back home, well, it had followed them now to their new home. And you sense in these verses that Peter is in a way pausing and just simply giving them a reality check. You sense that he's reminding them that they can't run from persecution, because as a follower of Jesus, it's going to follow them. But there's a but to all of this. And he says in verse 14, he says, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. And you get the impression that he doesn't want to just leave it there. He says that suffering is inevitable, but you are blessed. He says suffering is inevitable, but have no fear of them. He says that suffering is inevitable, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy. He says that suffering is inevitable, but still always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And do it with gentleness and respect. He says that suffering is inevitable, but it's better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. Peter's reminding them of something that he's already said a number of times already in this short letter. But he's telling them that they're not alone in their suffering, that God sees it, and that they're following in the footsteps of their Savior. Someone once asked C.S. Lewis, why is it that the righteous suffer? And C.S. Lewis replied with, why not? They're the only ones who are equipped from on high to be able to take it. And they're following in the footsteps of the one who sacrificed and suffered so much to give them their freedom. Well, the fourth piece of advice that Peter offers to them is found in verses 18 to 22, where Peter reminds them that in the midst of their suffering, there is a very profound hope to be found. And this is what he says about that hope. He writes, verse 18, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, for the righteous," that's him, "for the unrighteous," that's us, and the rest of humanity, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit. And then he goes on to tell us some of the things that were happening behind the scenes after Christ's death. He says, starting in verse 19, he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. He goes on to say in verse 21, baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. And we could easily spend a whole morning talking about all that is in those few verses. But as we look at those verses through our first century Middle Eastern glasses, please don't miss what Peter wants this group of persecuted Christians to grasp. Peter wants them to know that in the end, Jesus wins. He wants them to know that because of Jesus' death and his resurrection, that he will be victorious. Peter wants them to know that just as baptism is a symbol of the dirt being washed off, the spiritual dirt being washed off, that when it's all said and done, we will all be clean and with the Lord. And Peter wants them to know that through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as he says, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, that all powers, including that of the Roman Empire, are now subject to him. Peter wants them to know that they're loved, that their suffering is seen by God, that they're not alone, that they're blessed because of their suffering. He wants them to know that there's a master plan in the universe that God is in the process of playing out. And that because Jesus is the central figure in that master plan, that their faithfulness and their perseverance through this temporary suffering, that it's important. Peter wants them to know that their suffering is not without a purpose, and that the daily persecution that they experience will someday be rewarded because they have been set apart. There were times this past week as I was preparing for this message that I figuratively needed to take my first century glasses off and admit that my 21st century glasses really had no context to understand what these Christians went through. Not for all of us, but for most of us who've been brought up in North America. We just have no idea what it would be like to be in the middle of this type of persecution. And so the question needs to be asked, what is our takeaway from this section of Peter's letter? And whether you are being persecuted or not, I want to suggest to you that these principles or this advice that Peter is offering to these Christians is very relevant to us all as we wrestle with what it means for us, what it means for you and I to wrestle with what it means to represent Jesus well. Because in our country and in our province and in our city, we need to be followers of Jesus that grasp and embrace those same ideas. I don't need to convince any of you of this, but we live in a world where we need to guard our hearts against bitterness and against disillusionment. We live in a world where we need to learn to love our enemies. We need to remember that suffering for us as true followers of Jesus is inevitable. So don't be surprised, my friends, when it comes. But we also need to remember that there's a profound hope to be found in the midst of whatever life has thrown you and whatever life is currently throwing at you. Because as Peter said to this first century group of Christians, this is what it means to represent Jesus well. You are elect exiles. You are strangers in this land. This land is not your home. May he give us what we all need to represent him well. Let's pray.